Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Revolution here on IDAGIO. My name is Rachel Fenlon, and this is my weekly series in which I get the great pleasure of chatting with guests in the classical music world, people who inspire me, and chatting with them about what boundary pushing feels like in classical music, what risk-taking feels like. Today, I'm joined by conductor James Gaffigan. James is one of the major conductors of our time, leading orchestras everywhere from the New York Philharmonic, San Francisco Symphony, the Cleveland Orchestra, to the London Symphony Orchestra and the Munich Orchestra. He's also very at home in opera and has conducted at the Metropolitan Opera, the Wiener Staatsoper, Glyndebourne Festival Opera. And he has been the chief conductor of the Lucerne Symphony Orchestra for the past 12 years. He is recently appointed as the new guest conductor of the Trondheim Symphony, as well as the new chief conductor of the Verbier Junior Orchestra. It's a real pleasure to welcome him on the show today. Hi, James. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I would love to kind of dive in and ask you about your earliest experiences with music and whether there are any particular musical moments that jump out to you as really pivotal for you in your musical path.
Yeah, well, music has always been an important part of my life, and I gravitated towards music from a young age. I mean, no one in my family was musical. They didn't read music. There weren't any real musicians in my family, but for whatever reason, I gravitated towards the piano and kind of playing by ear, and then eventually guitar. And then I finally learned how to read music quite late. And I think if I look back, I'm happy that I didn't learn to read music before exploring the keyboard, because I kind of learned music in a very audio way, and I figured it out on my own. And I think I still have a really nice relationship to the notes because of that. So I don't see the notes on the page as, let's say, rules or strict boundaries. I just see them as information to expand upon. So, but from a very young age, I really enjoyed music of all types, mostly rock music and popular music. And then I remember discovering classical music in junior high school. And I remember thinking to myself that this music makes me feel a lot different than the other music I was listening to. And it was exciting to find out why.
And what kind of led you, like, after that into conducting specifically? Like, what was that moment like for you, deciding that that was the right thing for you?
Well, playing in an orchestra, I felt like a piece of the puzzle, and I wanted to know more information about the scores. And basically, these books of music, the scores, were unlocking all of the secrets to the music and why it made me feel a certain way and why it sounded that way. So I became fascinated with scores and kind of became an undercover, like, secret conductor, but I never really thought it would lead to that. And it eventually did, because I wanted more from music than just one small part. I wanted to understand the bigger picture.
And what were sort of, like, music education wise, what was the path to kind of getting there? Did you go through formal training as a conductor through music school, or?
Well, I mean, the good thing about growing up in New York City when I did, I had access to things that for free. I mean, my parents couldn't necessarily afford to send me to a really expensive music school, and the public school system gave me those opportunities with instruments and teachers. So that got me going. And then, then I started having formal training at places like Aspen Music Festival and School and Tanglewood. And then I went to graduate school at Rice University, the Shepherd School of Music, for conducting, finally. Yeah. But it wasn't until I was really 19 that then I decided I wanted to be a conductor.
One of the very obvious highlights of your career so far has been this position as chief conductor in Luzerne with the symphony orchestra. And I'm so curious what such a long-term relationship with your orchestra, with your audience, what that does for music making. Can you talk a little bit about
I mean, that's a great question. I believe it's like life, it's like relationships in life. I mean, there are quick friendships that they come and go, there are colleagues that come and go, and then there are the real true friends and your family. And I honestly feel like the Lucerne Symphony is a family, and like you say, the public. I would say we gained their trust after some time together. And then the public trusted us to present incredible programs and diverse programs, not just kind of the standard stuff they were always used to hearing. And I feel with every relationship, you know, it's returning and being honest with one another. I think it's sort of, I could compare it to dating. When a conductor meets an orchestra, the first date could go very well. But the reality is it's the second, third, and fourth date that really matter, because it's easy to fall in love, but having a real relationship and building upon that relationship, that's the hard part, but it's so rewarding in the end.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, the moment you started saying it, I was thinking the same thing. I'm curious about this, when you talk about also being able to challenge your audiences. I'm curious about how much you can challenge them, and what's your philosophy behind that? How much do you want to push your audience with repertoire, with just totally different concepts?
Yeah, I believe the audience should be challenged to a certain degree, but not too much. So I think there are festival environments where you could do whatever you want and you could really push the boundaries.
Right.
But I believe when you're cultivating an audience that you want to return often, I think you have to tease them once in a while with something that plays with their comfort zone. And I would say probably 40% of them really like it. 60% of them are not sure yet, you know. And I think we need to give them that regular dosage of diverse music, whether they want it or not, but not all the time. So I believe when there's a living composer I adore, we present it to them, but maybe not a 40-minute symphony for the first time, maybe a 10-minute piece or a 5-minute piece. And then they get to know that person and that person's music. And, you know, then they look forward to seeing it on the program again in the future or not. And I believe that the future is in diversity, and that an orchestra is versatile to play many different styles. Because if it's just meat and potatoes all the time, it becomes so boring. You know, I'm always shocked at marketing departments in the big orchestras. They're scared of doing something different because they only know the numbers for what has happened over the past few decades.
Yeah, for sure. Do you notice, I mean, it's just coming to me right now, but do you notice a difference between, I mean, now you're going to take this position in Trondheim, but I know you also work a lot in Norway. Do you notice a difference in sort of those communities and the relationship between the sort of symphony orchestra and that community, and how that's different, or the audiences?
Well, yeah, the more challenging things are like the big cities in the US, because they have their big orchestra, their famous orchestra, and they're used to hearing the repertoire that they hear. It's the smaller organizations, like, for example, Trondheim. The reason I took the position is they have such a loyal audience and they really love the orchestra. And it doesn't matter, you know, if a famous artist is coming or not, they're still going to come. And I think that's the beauty. I think we fear in the US, we fear that you need the big name, and that's the only way people are going to come. And I don't think that's necessarily true all the time. I think we need to build within these communities, whether big or small, an identity for the orchestra, and the orchestra then will attract audiences of all different types. And I mean, that's the beauty about the music that we do. I think everyone would love this music if they're given the opportunity to hear it.
Yeah, for sure. for sure. I read an interview of yours where you actually say, you know, we're in the time of people enjoying single malt scotch, so why not also go for the classical music? I mean, I thought that was a great quote, actually.
Yeah, you know,
because...
I just think that everyone researches everything on the internet. We have so much information at our fingertips. So if we want to go to a restaurant, we research pictures, we research who the chef is, where the chef is from, what kind of food are they making. We are all about farm to table. We know the farmers, we know who grows the lettuce in this town. I mean, it's just the amount of information we know about what we consume is so extreme. Why not with music? And I think, you know, we should support local, and we should be very aware of who these musicians are in these local communities, because I think they can give so much to you and your well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly, I mean, I live in Berlin, and that's certainly something you see in the German cities, is that feeling of like, oh, there's the violinist from the orchestra, you know, in the grocery store.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. In preparing this interview with you, I was sort of like musing on the idea of the conductor, and throughout this series of interviews with all these great classical musicians, of course, we talk a lot about what the interpreter is. And then I was thinking today, the conductor is sort of like the ultimate interpreter, because you're not just interpreting for yourself and making decisions for yourself, but you're also making decisions for this kind of huge collective of people, leading them through that. So I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions about that. First of all, do you have a kind of sort of general philosophy or process behind like sitting down and interpreting a score for the first time? That would be my first question.
Yeah. I sort of have my own regimen of how I learn a piece of music. And it normally, if it's a piece of music that it exists already and has existed for some time, the first thing I do is listen to a few recordings and just get my head around the piece in general without the score, because I just want to experience it as a listener, as an audience member. And then I put away the recordings for good, because I think it's very dangerous to have a favorite recording, because you start subconsciously being influenced by that if you listen over and over again. And then I start with the notes, and I go from big to small. So big form, kind of see what form the piece is in. If it's a symphony, how many movements is it? What kind of form is it in? ABA? Is it something new through composed? And then I dig deeper, harmonic process, studying harmonies, not just to know them, but to, when you're in rehearsal, if something goes wrong, you should know what you're supposed to hear, and how to fix it and quickly fix it. And then you dig even deeper to interpretive things like phrasing and balancing an orchestra. You know, having said all that, we're just like a prism in which all this color is shining through, because we're not making the sound, actually. These brilliant orchestra musicians and singers are. So I think the analogy I always use for people like my father, who's not a musician, it's like being a great coach of a team, of a football team, soccer team, where you're dealing with all this talent, and somehow you need to have them come together with the same vision. But yeah, studying is a fun process. I like to do it in silence. When it's complex harmonies, I like to go to a piano just to hear. If I can't hear it from the page in my imagination, I'll go to a piano and try to play through it. But yeah, so I just basically work big to small, and then I test myself regularly. I kind of go through it mentally before bed, or if I'm walking to a rehearsal, I'll go through it in my head. Hopefully not get hit by a car on the street, but yeah, I take it very seriously, because I think, like you said, it's this huge collective. So many people are depending on me. And I think the conductor's ultimate goal is to help when you need help and stay out of the way when people don't need help.
Right. Right. Are there ever times, I'm sure there have been times, where you have a really clear idea of what you want to do with a piece, but that's challenged or influenced when you're actually in the room with the players, in like a quite a substantial. Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, there are two things to do when that happens, and of course it happens. I think sometimes it happens for the better. If I run a piece of music with the Cleveland Orchestra and I think, wow, that's better than I imagined it. So forget my rehearsal plan with that one section. That was actually a pleasant surprise. But other times, yeah, sometimes there's limitations of technical things, or by maybe someone who has a very complex solo, they need a little more time to make it work. And I think the beauty in being a musician is having that option of compromise. And I love working with singers for that reason. Every singer's voice spins at a different rate. Every voice moves differently, and everyone's tempo is slightly different on actually day to day. So I think the flexibility is really important, and having an open mind, because if you're a control freak, you probably shouldn't be in the music world.
I really love that idea about compromise. Yeah, that's so true. I never thought of that before. So that's yeah. There's a great essay that or an article that you wrote in the spring of this last year, like, because it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and you talk about it's building trust through music, and it's like a 3-part, and it's really great. So anyone watching should read that as well. And like so much of what you say mirrors like life and the human experience, right? Building trust. And you say, I just want to quote something here for our audience. Freedom is born from trust, and freedom empowers musicians to play thrillingly on their edge. And I'm curious, what are some of the pillars for you that need to be in place for that to happen?
Well, I think, first of all, a musician is to a certain degree an athlete, and they need to feel comfortable and safe. And this is something I always talk about in regards to Verbier with the junior orchestra. These young people are doing this for the first time, and there's a lot of pressure there. There's pressure mostly from their colleagues. It's not really, let's say, it's not on purpose, but it's there. So I think to make a musician feel safe, there are many things you can do as a conductor. First of all, you have to be kind with your words and be very careful with what words you use when you're dealing with an issue. I think you also need to make sure that you're not judging them when you're listening to them. I mean, there's a way to listen as a musician with judgment and without judgment. And I think that's, a musician feels that. And also physically what you do, how you invite a musician to play is very important in my line of work. If you give a horn player a cue like this and say, right before he or she plays, that's horrible. Right. You're just asking for trouble. And if you do this to a singer or this to a singer while they're singing, what's the purpose of that? Like, that's it's horrible. And I think that in the rehearsal room, you have to keep a very calm feeling and a kind of. I have a lot of work to do. I'm a very meticulous worker, and then as the rehearsal goes on, I let go more and more. And I think that if the musician knows nothing's personal, it's all about doing justice to the composer in the end, then they won't feel attacked. They won't feel like they're playing flat. They'll feel like, okay, my function in the chord, because I'm not function, I have to bring my pitch up a little bit. So, I think you have to keep it a little bit abstract and make people realize we're all in this together, and we all have insecurities. It's just that rehearsal room needs to be a place of safety.
Yeah. When you're kind of guest conducting and you have maybe only 2 or 3 rehearsals with an orchestra, is that process different? I mean, I can imagine that that's even more challenging to kind of build that relationship really, really quickly.
Yeah, it is, but a lot can happen in 2 days of rehearsals, and I think that the higher level of the orchestra, the more extreme the growth is, the growth process. And so I find, again, comparing it to something in life like dating, it's like going out on a great date a week with an orchestra. But if you have a relationship with that orchestra, you take over from where you left off each time. Whereas that first date is magnificent. It's so fun. There's butterflies in your stomach, all those things. But you're right. Only so much can happen in that week, but it can be the basis of something much bigger. With opera productions, it's different. You live there for like a month. And so I think it's a much different situation. You become like a family for that one period of that production.
I was going to ask you about opera because I mean, this is also a substantial, I mean, you're at home in both of these things. And and how are the challenges different when you have the elements of, specifically the elements of theater and a director and that collaboration? What kind of challenges as a conductor are different for you in that experience?
Well, in the opera world, there's so much happening at once. I mean, there's makeup, costumes, lighting, the sets, the director, the music, the chorus. There's just so many pieces of the puzzle. And I love that. In a way, I love opera so much because nobody sees me. The public doesn't stare at the conductor during the opera. I mean, some people do, I guess, if you're sitting up higher. But I love the idea of like what Wagner had in mind, that the orchestra is not in the picture. They're there, they're creating the sound, they're creating the mood, but you don't see them. They're underneath the stage. So is the conductor. So I love that image, and I love that I'm helping people without being seen. I mean, I'm not a martyr. I'm selfish in some ways, but I love this aspect of opera, that I have a big role, but it's not a role that's seen by the public. So yeah, dealing with the director can have its challenges. I mean, but also could be an absolute pleasure. I've 90% had great experiences with directors. And sometimes, again, you have to compromise on some of your musical ideas. But usually the director has their reasons. And I love people that have reasons for their ideas. I can't stand when someone says, oh, I just take a little time here because it feels good. Like, that's nice, but what's your real reason for taking time? And I like people to have reasons. And I think in life too, you should have reasons for what you do, especially if it damages the feelings of someone else, or makes someone else's life complicated.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose that theater is a really direct way to do, like, or having that dramatic, always going back to that dramatic theatrical narrative. It's a great way to do that with music specifically, or.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love the theater. I find it to be a reflection of life and the world as it is today and was. And I don't know, I love just walking into a new theater and feeling the energy there. There's just so many things at work. It's so exciting.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking at a really specific time in the classical music world, being, silent for almost 1 year. And I wanted to ask you whether you feel during this time that you've sort of questioned yourself differently as an artist, or whether we might ourselves as classical musicians question what we do or the industry. Like, have there been sort of revelations around that?
Oh, absolutely. I think everyone has questioned this and their kind of, what is their role in this world? I mean, we took everything for granted. I think we all felt that way before this pandemic. We all feel that way, that we took it for granted. So I am thinking very differently about the future. And it's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about my role in education with Verbier and kind of giving back to these young people, because it gives me so much pleasure and hope for the future of music. And also with Trondheim, in a smaller city, that it doesn't have to just be big organization after the other. I believe in this city and the people in the orchestra. But my role and what I do, yeah, I think very differently about it. I think very differently about programming. I want more of an intimate feeling in these big orchestral worlds. I don't think we have to use the whole orchestra the entire time. We can have a solo cello play something in between, let's say, the movements when they move a piano on the stage. We can have some spoken word by a poet that lives in the community. We can have some visual art during a specific piece of music that requires it. I just think that the idea of overture, concerto, symphony is over. And especially this pandemic has shown that that's not what we need. We need the human relationship. And it doesn't matter if it's an audience of 10 or 10,000, like somewhere like the Hollywood Bowl or something. There's room for both in this world. And I think that we need to push the boundaries much more of what the concert experience is. And then the public will come. I mean, it's as simple as that. And we have to make the people who have money and they're let's say the people who make a lot of money, I believe if they love something, they should give a lot of money to that. Like I said before, with wine or single malt scotch. And if there are people who don't have money, we need to make it affordable for them to get to this experience. Yeah. I mean, something recently that happened to me right before the pandemic was I went to see my colleague Yannick conduct Turandot at the Met. And Turandot's a piece of music that I love, but these grandiose operatic experiences, sometimes I find them to be a little kitsch. And I told my colleague, no, I don't want to go see Turandot. I'm not in the mood tonight. And just come backstage, watch it from backstage, just this specific moment. And I went and I cried, not just because of the beauty and the grandeur of the experience, but because there are many people that will never experience that. And that made me really sad, because I'm pretty convinced that if anybody saw that, or these Zeffirelli productions or whatever, it's going to strike a nerve and they're going to want more. And it just made me think, wow, there's so many people that would never think of setting foot inside the Met because they can't afford it, or they don't have babysitters, or whatever the reason may be. So that I'm kind of on a mission in that respect, to make sure whatever institution I have a large role in, that people are welcome, people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's really important.
Yeah. Circling back to the education, do you want that, could you imagine that also being a component of sort of running a house, or being chief conductor, outreach elements, or, because I think you're just absolutely right. It's so much about education as well, because even if you have the resources, even if these things are, in Berlin, it's 10 euros to go and see the Philharmonic play. I mean, it's 10 euros, so anyone can go, but not anyone goes. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that, in terms of education and outreach?
Education and outreach has always been something that's very important to American institutions and German institutions. But the difference now, like when I was a student, young singers would go do outreach to these crazy gymnasiums in public schools, and they would be, it was really sometimes rewarding and sometimes really challenging. And I found that it was always for the singer that was up and coming to do something like that. Whereas I think that's completely backwards. I think, just as you were doing that, I think the Renee Flemings of the world, Joyce DiDonatos, they should also do that. And they do now. But that's how we were backwards at that time, thinking that's for the young singers to do. I think education is excuse the word, but it's the sexiest thing we can do today for fundraising and also for the future. I mean, people wonder why. It makes me so upset when I have these interviews with big papers and they say, what's your thoughts about female conductors or female? And I said, what are we talking about? That, you know, everyone's trying to find a solution, like a band-aid to the problem. The problem is we're not giving females the right opportunities when they're 13 through 19. And as a conductor, you know, when I was a conducting student, there was maybe one female student at Aspen, or two maybe, but it was always kind of like, then that was their in. It shouldn't be like that. And I really think we need to be very clear about equality, that everyone gets these opportunities when they're younger. That's where it is. It's education. It's not right now finding every female composer, every female conductor on the planet. That's just a band-aid. Yeah, that's nice. But so I think education, if you have a big institution, education should be a huge part of the budget, and it will just fund the future. It's like, you know, it's like investing in a great stock or institution. It's going to pay back later. And I don't think people have always realized it. They thought, oh, there's an education concert, get the assistant conductor to do it. You know, and that was something I said to, I've been in a music director search for a large institution in the US. They thought I was crazy for wanting to do education concerts. They said, you would do those concerts? I said, of course. What does it say if I don't do them as music director? It sends the wrong message that these are not important.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's about that message, actually, from the institution, from the people leading it, from also, like you say, from also the top musicians at those institutions as well. That and by them prioritizing it. Yeah, I love that. I really love that. I mean, of course, then another natural question would be asking you about new music, because I think that also allows for this sort of evolution of what we do, of this art form of classical music. How much do you commission new music, and like, what's your, what are you looking for when you're commissioning a composer, for example? For
I feel I do a lot of commissioning and a lot of new pieces. It's always been part of my life. That's the way I started conducting. I was conducting the new pieces that the conducting students didn't want to conduct, you know, and that I got the opportunity to conduct because of modern music. So I have a lot of respect for composers, because I for one can't do it. If I try to write something, it sounds like a bad version of all the composers I'm studying. I have a lot of respect for them, and yeah, it's challenging sometimes with the bigger institutions to get them on the program. But I find the institutions in the US, like the Detroit Symphony or Atlanta Symphony, they're very open to programming modern music. And if I give them a recommendation, they say, sure. It's the bigger ones that are a challenge.
Interesting.
And yeah, I know. I find it as a shock, because some of the most revolutionary big organizations, I won't say who, because I love working with them, they say, yeah, I'm not so sure about this composer. It's you know, how about John Adams? And I say, yeah, okay, but you know, I love John Adams, but you know, there's so many other people out there. So I think it's so important. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, and I love doing it. And commissioned someone just in Lucerne, Francisco Cole, the composer, just wrote a piece for me, and as a gift, a surprise gift for my tenure. And I was so moved by that, because he's one of my favorite composers. And I know other conductors get watches and, you know, something from an orchestra thanking them for their decade of work. I'm happy to get a piece of music. I find it really emotional. So yeah, I believe in it. But again, the way you present it to an audience needs to be in an important way. If it's hidden, like, this is another thing that drives me crazy. Some of the biggest orchestras, they will do a big symphony, Mahler's symphony, or I don't know, Dvorak's symphony, something, a concerto with a famous soloist, And then they'll say, okay, we're going to do this modern piece. And it has nothing to do with the rest of the program. And it drives me crazy because there's no thread, there's no line. It's like, hide the new piece. It's like, well, we have Josh Bell as a soloist, so let's do this psychotic new piece that no one cares about first, you know? And it sends the wrong message to the public. It's like, okay, if we sit through this piece, we get to see Josh Bell. And it also says, oh, if we come a little late, we're not going to miss much. We're going to miss the modern piece, you know? And yeah, this is a pet peeve of mine. So I hope to change it. I feel like as life goes, I'm 41 now. And when I was in my 20s trying to present these composers, nobody listened to me. And now I would say 50% of the organizations trust me if I bring a composer to the table.
Yeah. And it also goes back to kind of what you said when you're questioning yourself in this time right now about the format of concert and of programming. I think it's also just, you know, reconfiguring that and saying, because it's absolutely about how we present these things to our audience, and kind of like the education thing. You know, if we say it's not so important, then people will feel it. Yeah. I'm curious on like a very like on a personal level with new music or with commissioning, what elements or like what's essential for you in a composer, and particularly something I've been thinking about lately anyway is how difficult it is to write a new piece for the orchestra, and how it's almost impossible in a way to be innovative, but perhaps it's not. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what you're looking for. Do you have personal aesthetic kind of requirements?
Yeah, I personally have a list of things that are important to me. You know, I could separate the composers who are trying to be revolutionary and trying to push the boundaries from the ones that are just doing what they want to do. And in a way, I prefer the ones who do what they want to do. Because there are so many different combinations of things you could do as a composer. And I think as long as there's something human about these composers, as long as I can relate to a sound that they designed from the orchestra, I'm in. It's just when it becomes a mathematical experiment, or they say, if a young composer gets quadruple woodwinds and a huge brass section and they have to use everyone in the orchestra, I find that becomes more of an experiment or an exercise than it does a piece from your heart. The problem is that these composers, they get a commission and then there's a lot of pressure on them to produce something in that time. And as you know, life doesn't always work like that. You can't. So like you, I have tremendous respect for these composers that are, you know, writing for this traditional instrument that is hundreds of years old. So it's kind of backwards.
Yeah.
But then again, we do the same thing with food. You know, we do the same thing with wine making. Same techniques, but just looking towards the future. So I think people are thinking very differently about food and plant-based food. And I think it's the same thing with composition. They're looking at the orchestra in a different way. And I think I relate to people who can write, I hate to say it, it sounds so cliche, but write a tune or write something that I feel, something that I feel as a human being and I relate to. Other times, I like certain composers that create an atmosphere and makes you feel funny or different. And I think there are many dead composers that do that, like Sibelius or Debussy. They create an atmosphere that's completely magical, and you don't know how they do that. And I love that with modern composers too, when they create something, an overall feeling, and they're true artists in that respect. So yeah, I just want to be touched by this music, and then I will do everything in my power to bring it to life.
Love that. James, I would just ask you my final question, sort of hence the title of the series. And it's how and when do you feel music can be revolutionary?
Well, I think music has so much potential to help people. And I think that we forget that. And sometimes within this pandemic, I felt very small within my role in this world, in society. But then I realized how much music has helped me. And I realized how much it's helped many of my colleagues and friends. So I think music is revolutionary because we can help one another with it, and we can speak to one another with it, even if we come from entirely different backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds and religions. I think music could bridge the gap of people, and I just love that. And I'm honored to have this as my profession.
Beautifully said.
Oh, no, I don't know.
James, thank you so much for making
it's
time
lovely.
to
I have to
chat
say, it's lovely
just
speaking to you.
feel-
I really loved it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wishing you all the best, and especially with all the upcoming new adventures for you, and that you stay healthy and well and everything. So thank you.
Thank you. I wish all the best for you.
Thank you to everyone else. Thanks. And thank you to all of you for tuning in, and I will see you again next Wednesday.